Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 21 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Chicago Blackhawks, in which the Sharks have won 2-0. And with the big news coming from the San Jose Sharks side earlier today that Evander Kane was being put onto waivers, something that I will discuss more at length in a video tomorrow, a lot of people maybe even forgot that there was even a Sharks game here tonight, but indeed there was. The Sharks were in Chicago for the game, and they get their second shutout of the season. And it's all well and nice that the Sharks actually managed to get a victory, to get back into the win column here, and have now won 3 of their last 4 games. When you take a bit of a deeper look, is that there was a lot of issues that continue to plague the San Jose Sharks, and that really was indeed still the case for this game here today. So in the first period, at least the first half of the first period, things were relatively even. Neither team was getting too much going in terms of scoring chances, but it was in the latter half of that first period where things just went completely sideways for the San Jose Sharks. They looked just completely awful in the last 10 minutes of that first period. The Blackhawks peppered them, and specifically James Reimer, with golden grade A opportunities. And the Sharks were very lucky that James Reimer decided to show up and just completely stand on his head today, or else the Sharks could have easily found themselves down 2 to 3 goals by the time this first period ended. But instead, the game was luckily still tied, and it allowed the Sharks in the second period, where it recently has actually been a pretty bad period for the Sharks, to actually turn things around and make a bit of a comeback for themselves. The second period was definitely mostly controlled by the Sharks, and they would score the first and only goal of this game on a manned net. When Rudolf Balcers would take a shot, it would get tipped by Timo Meier after we had a beautiful pass from Logan Couture to just redirect this one to Balcers, and so the Sharks would make it 1-0 in that second period, which would be the score after 40 minutes. In the third period, the Sharks would absolutely go into full-on turtle mode, right? There's turtle mode, which we have seen many times from the San Jose Sharks thus far in the third periods of this season, but this was like extreme turtle mode. This was like taking it to the next level, like a 180-year-old tortoise type of mode, because the Sharks just got zero offense going, but to their credit, kind of locked it down a bit defensively compared to, let's say, that latter half of the first period where it was just kind of open season against the Sharks defense, and the Blackhawks were getting chance after chance after chance to score a goal. In the third period, while the Sharks were obviously hemmed in their own zone pretty consistently, I think the Sharks only actually ended up with, 2 shots on a manned net in that third period. The Blackhawks didn't necessarily get a ton of great scoring chances in that third period, which was definitely nice to see. So Reimer had been tasked with standing on his head in that first period. In the third, while he still obviously had to make some nice saves, it wasn't necessarily as demanding in that final frame, and so the Sharks would end up getting the empty netter, another from Meier, his 9th of the year, and the Sharks win 2-0. Moving on to the lineup here, we had the return of Jonathan Dahlen for tonight's game. He would rejoin this first line, no surprise there, as Meier, Couture, and Dahlen would get reunited, and they were once again the Sharks. I don't think this is anything controversial to say, their best line of the night. This was probably the only line in that first period that actually looked relatively impressive, even when the Sharks were kind of getting destroyed, and so I guess that's saying something. But as the game went on, they were getting most of the chances for the San Jose Sharks, because as I said, another issue that has plagued the Sharks this season, besides their puck management at times, has been their lack of scoring. And so to see this first line continue to be really the only line actually generating much chances at all is somewhat disappointing, as the Sharks are definitely going to need something from their bottom 9 forwards if they want a chance of being able to win games much more consistently than they have been. Because to put this into perspective, the Sharks scored the same amount of goals in today's game as they did against the Toronto Maple Leafs the other day. It's just that James Reimer stood on his head completely here tonight and didn't do so as much in that game against the Maple Leafs. On to the second line, they had a couple of chances as Balcers was reunited with Hertl and Barabanov, and Gregor was demoted down from that second line to, I guess you could call it, the fourth line. Barabanov did have that one very good chance, a nice move by him, so kind of similar to the one he had against the Toronto Maple Leafs, but he gets robbed by Marc-Andre Fleury. Otherwise, though, this line didn't really get much generated. Hertl, Barabanov, and Balcers, well, I guess Balcers did have that very nice shot that led to the only Sharks Sharks goal. But when it comes to Hertl and Barabanov, there's just not really a consistent effort from these two players, and it just feels as though I'm sounding like a broken record when I say that, because it seems to be the case for almost every single game that the Sharks played. They are very much one and done, kind of sporadically contributing to the San Jose Sharks offense, and it's just kind of disappointing to see, because the two players, especially near the end of last season, and you could say maybe Evander Kane did play a big role on that as the third player on that line, but these two players had a very nice end to the last season, and they haven't necessarily carried it so much into this year. I know Hertl has a lot of points, but it just doesn't really feel as though the eye test is really doing him a lot of favors. On to the bottom six, also a pretty big issue for the San Jose Sharks is that these six players just haven't really been having all that great of games. I'm not going to necessarily sit here and say that they've been terrible. I don't think any of these players have just been completely awful, liabilities or anything along those lines. But if I go through the names on this list, like Weatherby, Cogliano, LeBanc, Matt Nieto, how many of these players in this entire season have I actually at one point post-game said, wow, this guy was just so fantastic? I mean, maybe LeBanc has had a couple, maybe Weatherby has had a couple, but when we're 21 games into the season, you're probably hoping for more than a couple, and obviously I'm not expecting Jasper Weatherby to be a 20-goal, 40-point scorer or anything like that. I'm not expecting Cogliano to just light it up from that fourth line, but I am expecting a bit more of a consistent offensive performance, because maybe I can count on, like, not even on one hand, but with like two fingers, how many good shifts that these bottom six players actually had in the offensive zone in tonight's game. Bonino, Cogliano, and Gregor, I guess you could call them the third line. Fourth line doesn't really matter. They looked at least a bit better than the other line of Weatherby, Nieto, and LeBanc. Probably had a couple more shifts. That one can be counted on one hand and not just a couple of fingers. But just generally, the Sharks will absolutely need more from this bottom six. As I said, I'm not expecting world-beating numbers, but I am expecting a bottom six that can help contribute, because right now it really does seem that it's the first line having to carry the vast majority of the offense, with just every once in a while somebody in that bottom nine contributing, and that's just not really a recipe to win more games than not. You can't really expect James Reimer or whoever's in nets to be able to carry every game like he did here tonight, because it was absolutely a game stolen by him, which I'll get to a bit later. On to the defensive side of things, once again, I would say that Burns and Ferraro did a pretty admirable job in tonight's game. I thought Burns showed a very nice active stick in multiple moments in this particular game. Maybe 4 or 5 times he was able to knock pucks out of the air or intercept passes. That was quite nice to see. And generally, while of course in that third period, it's not going to help their Corsi numbers or whatever advanced stats you're into, because of the fact that they were hemmed into their own zone a lot in that third period. But I think they did a pretty admirable job throughout most of this game of limiting chances, if you kind of discount that last 10 minutes of the first period. Same to go with the second pairing, I would say. Erik Karlsson, definitely a much better game than he had against the Toronto Maple Leafs in his previous one. Definitely stepped up, wasn't making as many boneheaded mistakes, and just generally played a rather solid game. There wasn't anything crazy offensively, but that will obviously come eventually. If he can just limit his defensive errors to just a couple per game, or obviously optimally none per game, that would definitely be the first thing that the Sharks are going to hope out of number 65. And then finally, when it comes to that bottom pairing of Simek and Vlasic, I actually made the prediction after that Toronto game that one of these two players might get swapped out here for the first game of this road trip, but that doesn't end up happening. Both Simek and Vlasic remain in the lineup here tonight against the Chicago Blackhawks. Was that the right call? I'm not entirely sure, though I'm not going to sit here and say that Hatakau would have been necessarily that much better of an option than these other two players. I don't think Simek and Vlasic were awful. I don't think they were particularly good either. I mean, there was just this one shift in the first period that really stood out for me as something that's just been a really big issue for Vlasic and Simek, is that unlike in the first couple of pairings where, Burns in particular can do a pretty good job at breaking pucks out, same goes with someone like Erik Karlsson on that second pairing. On the third pairing, there isn't necessarily a player on it who has the ability to skillfully break a puck out. So I'm just watching on this one particular shift that I'm talking about. It was a miscued pass from Vlasic to Simek that ends up having to turn around the defense and allows the Blackhawks to stay in the zone for a bit longer. And then on that very same shift, shift, still in the defensive zone. It was another miscued pass from Šimek to Vlasic, which again allowed the Blackhawks to stay in the zone a bit longer. It didn't lead to a goal, obviously, as the Blackhawks did not score in tonight's game. However, it was still something that's just been a real consistent issue for this defensive pairing. You want to see a bit more crispness from them. You want to see a bit more skilled play from them to be able to actually break pucks out of the zone, because as I've said already earlier on in this video, puck management has at times been a massive issue for the San Jose Sharks this season. It's a big reason why they've lost many of the games that they have lost, and so they need to clean that up. And finally, to talk about the goaltender, Reimer gets the 4th straight start here for himself after he got pulled in the previous game against the Toronto Maple Leafs. I obviously said that only one of the goal you could potentially say was his fault, and so Bob Booner has complete confidence in James Reimer to say, you know what, get back out there and have a better game, and Reimer absolutely delivers. As I said, in that first period, the last 10 minutes of it, he had to make maybe 5 grade A super high danger saves that it was just kind of crazy to watch how many nail-biting moments there were in that first period that James Reimer was just able to come up with the massive save. So it is the second shutout of the year for the Sharks. The first one was by Adin Hill, which I would honestly say was not nearly as impressive as the shutout that James Reimer just put up in tonight's game. And so when we move on into the next one that the Sharks do indeed have, while you might say, oh, well, now with 4 straight games for James Reimer, would it make sense for Adin Hill to now get another game? Well, it's kind of hard to say that when Reimer just puts up a shutout, so I would definitely not be surprised to see Reimer once again getting a 5th straight start here in the upcoming game. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Wednesday, or on Tuesday actually, where they will take on the New Jersey Devils. Also, for the second and final time this season, the Sharks have been getting a lot of their Eastern Conference matchups done very quickly thus far this season. That will be the 22nd game of the year, and the Sharks will have already played the Canadiens twice, the Senators twice, the Leafs twice, and now the New Jersey Devils twice. So in comparison, the Sharks have only played a divisional opponent a single time this season, that being the Calgary Flames. So that will obviously be a big thing as the schedule goes later on. The Sharks in their previous game against the Devils lost 3-2 in a shootout. That was a game that James Reimer also started, and we'll see if the Sharks can get a victory versus New Jersey. Class dismissed.